I woke up with the familiar, suffocating scent of expensive bourbon and the metallic tang of blood, the permanent cologne of a legendary assassin. The air in the penthouse felt heavy, thick with the unspoken words of a man who was about to walk out the door. In my previous life, this was the exact moment I had shattered. I had fallen to my knees on this pristine carpet, clutching the hem of his tactical coat, begging him to stay for the sake of the fragile life growing inside me. But that pathetic merman, the one who had withered away in a cramped apartment hiding his scales from the world, was dead. I had choked on my own devotion once. I wasn't going to do it again. I opened my eyes. Hunter stood by the balcony door, a lethal silhouette cutting against the city lights. He was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, destructive and different, and completely out of reach. "I have to leave," Hunter said, his voice a jagged rasp that used to make my knees weak. Now, it only made my skin crawl. "The mission has changed. It's too dangerous for you. I've cleared the accounts. There's a black card on the nightstand. It's enough for you to live comfortably." He expected tears. He expected the desperate clinging of the fragile creature he thought I was. Instead, I swung my legs off the bed, my body humming with the strain, untamed vitality of a siren in his prime. I picked up the titanium card, the cold metal grounding me. "Understood," I said. My voice was calm, resonating with the subtle, hypnotic frequency of the deep ocean. Hunter paused, his broad shoulders stiffening. He turned his head slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Elia's eye." "My name is Ethan now," I interrupted, my tone cutting through his excuses like a freshly honed blade. I looked him dead in the eye, my gaze unfaltering. "And my door only opens one way. You just step through the exit. Don't look back." I didn't wait for his response. I packed my professional culinary knives, took his blood money, and vanished before the sun breached the horizon. I didn't hide in a cheap motel this time. I booked a first-class flight straight to Seattle. If Hunter wanted to fund my disappearance, I was going to use his wealth to build an empire on the foggy, salt-drenched shores of the West Coast. Finding the perfect location was easy. I bought a rundown diner in the Harbor District. It was damp, slightly miserable, and strategically located directly across the street from a heavily guarded, windowless warehouse, the syndicate's West Coast headquarters, the belly of the beast. I didn't run from the shadows anymore. I set up camp right on their doorstep. I named it Ethan's Seafood Barbecue. A few weeks later, during a relentless midnight storm, my son was born. There were no doctors, no sterile hospital rooms, just me, the crashing Seattle thunder, and a cheap inflatable kiddie pool filled with highly concentrated Atlantic sea salt in the back alley of the diner. When he emerged, he didn't cry. He opened his vast, oceanic blue eyes, let out a soft purr that vibrated the water, and showed a glimpse of razor-sharp teeth. "You are Dylan," I whispered, pressing him against my chest, feeling the primitive strength in his tiny limbs. "And you will never hide in the dark." Fast forward 18 months. The grill at Ethan's Seafood Barbecue was burning white-hot. I stood behind the counter, a heavy meat cleaver in hand, wearing a dark apron over my chef's whites. The scent of charred squid, crushed red chilies, and deep-sea salt filled the air. With calculated precision, I had angled my industrial exhaust fans to blow the thick, spicy smoke directly across the street, straight into the air intake vents of the syndicate's headquarters. Let the deadliest assassins in America choke on my marinade. The diner's bell chimed. Two mountains of muscle stepped in. Vinny and Duke. I recognized them instantly, high-ranking enforcers for the syndicate. They looked like they snapped necks for cardio. "Listen here, pretty boy," Vinny snarled, slamming a massive hand on a table. "Your damn smoke is setting off the biohazard alarms over there. Shut the grill down, or we shut you down." I didn't blink. I flicked my wrist, and a silver oyster-shucking knife flew through the air, burying itself into the wooden table exactly half an inch between Vinny's thick fingers. Both men froze, the color draining from their faces. "Zit," I commanded, my voice dropping into that terrifying siren pitch. "Eat." I slammed 2 plates of my signature magic grilled squid in front of them. It was infused with kelp extract and a fraction of my merman essence. One bite, and the granite face killers melted. Duke actually let out a small sob. Within 10 minutes, they had polished off 3 plates, aggressively wiped their mouths, and looked at me with absolute reverence. "Whatever you need, boss," Vinny stuttered, leaving a $100 tip. "We got your back." They became my first regulars. But the real catch of the day arrived a week later. The door didn't just open, it was nearly kicked off its hinges. The bell screamed. The air in the diner instantly plummeted 10 degrees, thick with the scent of gunpowder and desperation. Hunter. He looked like a ghost. He was hollowed out, his eyes dark and frantic from 18 months of turning the American underworld upside down to find his fragile, helpless lover. He stormed in, fully prepared to execute whatever arrogant cook was blowing smoke into his sanctuary. Then, the scent of the deep Atlantic hit him. He froze mid-stride. I stood behind the counter, casually wiping fish blood off my cleaver with a white towel. I looked at him with the cold, unbothered calculation of a predator. Next to me on the stainless steel prep table sat my 18-month-old son Dylan. Hunter's eyes darted to the boy. Dylan looked right back at the legendary assassin, blinked his innocent blue eyes, and calmly bit down on a solid oyster shell. The loud, brutal crunch of the shell breaking under the toddler's teeth echoed in the dead silent room. Hunter stopped breathing. The gun in his hand slowly slipped, pointing at the floor. He looked at me, completely shattered, realizing the fragile creature he had abandoned had evolved into a king. I tossed the bloody towel aside and offered him a razor-sharp, mocking smile. "Table for one, Mr. Assassin," I asked softly. "Or are you just here to clean the floors?" The silence in the diner was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic, horrifying crunch of my 18-month-old son pulverizing a solid oyster shell between his teeth. Hunter's custom-made Glock hit the linoleum floor with a heavy dead thud. He didn't even flinch. His eyes, usually sharp enough to track a target in pitch darkness, were blown wide, fixed on the tiny boy sitting on my stainless steel prep table. He looked at Dylan's ocean blue eyes, then at the faint, iridescent scales shimmering near the boy's temples under the fluorescent lights. The math wasn't hard to do, even for a killer. Then, the legendary assassin of the syndicate did something I had never seen him do in my past life. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the greasy floor of my diner, right amid the sawdust and discarded crab legs. "Elias," his voice broke, a ragged sound of a man discovering he had cut out his own heart. "Ethan," I corrected him smoothly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I wiped my cleaver one last time, the cold steel gleaming. "Elias died on a pristine carpet in a penthouse, begging a ghost to stay. Ethan is the man standing before you, who owns this block." Hunter didn't argue. He looked up at me from the floor, his face a portrait of absolute devastation. "I didn't know. I swear to you, if I had known you were carrying, you would have stayed out of obligation." I cut him off, a sharp, bitter laugh escaping my lips. "I don't need a warden, Hunter. And my son doesn't need a part-time shadow. You left to protect me supposedly. Well, look around. I am the apex predator of this harbor now." He bowed his head, his broad, lethal shoulders shaking slightly. "I'll do anything. Tell me what you want, my money, my life, my blood. I'll walk away from the syndicate tonight, just let me be near him. Let me be near you." I looked down at the man who had been my entire universe. In my first life, this apology would have been enough to make me fall into his arms weeping. Now, it only sounded like an employment application. "Anything?" I asked, my tone dropping into a hypnotic, dangerous hum. "Anything," he rasped, looking up with desperate hope. I reached under the counter. I didn't pull out a gun. I pulled out a stack of heavily stapled papers and a piece of fabric. I tossed them, hitting him squarely in his broad chest. Hunter blinked, picking up the fabric. It was a violently bright, hot pink apron with the words "Kiss the cook or he'll chop you" emblazoned across the front in sparkly glitter. Beneath it was a standard minimum wage employment contract. "You want a place in my life," I said, leaning over the counter. "You start at the bottom. You mop the floors. You scrub the toilets. You serve the tables. 50 years of indentured servitude. Minimum wage. No benefits. You touch a gun inside my walls. You're fired. You raise your voice. You're fired. Put on the apron, or get out of my diner." Hunter stared at the pink monstrosity. The deadliest man in North America, a man who charged $1 million a hit, silently slipped the pink loop over his head and tied the strings behind his waist. "Where are the mops, boss?" he whispered. The transition was a spectacle. Over the next 3 days, the terrifying ghost of the syndicate became Ethan's seafood barbecue's worst busboy. But the real entertainment began on Friday night. The bell chimed, and Vinny and Duke swaggered in. They were laughing, probably fresh off a successful extortion run, ready for their daily dose of magic squid. They claimed their usual corner booths, slamming their massive fists on the table. "Hey, boss," Vinny hollered at me. "2 platters of the spicy tentacles. And tell your new busboy to wipe down our table. It's sticky." A figure emerged from the back kitchen holding a spray bottle of bleach and a dirty rag. He was wearing tactical black combat pants, combat boots, and a sparkly hot pink apron. Vinny and Duke turned, they froze. The blood drained from their meaty faces so fast they looked like corpses. Boss, Duke squeaked, his voice cracking by 3 octaves. Hunter stood there, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would shatter. His eyes promised a slow, agonizing death to both of them. But he remembered my rule, slowly, humiliatingly. The legendary assassin sprayed the table and began wiping it down. Lift your elbows, Vinny. Hunter growled softly. Vinny whimpered, practically levitating his arms. Once Hunter turned around to walk back to the kitchen, the absolute shock wore off. The sheer absurdity of the situation took over. I watched from the grill as Vinny slowly, carefully pulled out his smartphone. With shaking hands, he zoomed in and snapped a photo of Hunter's pink apron-clad back. The group chat is gonna lose its mind, Vinny whispered to Duke, practically vibrating with glee. I smirked, flipping a sizzling scallop. My fan club was proving very useful. But the ultimate humiliation didn't come from the syndicate grunts. It came from a toddler. Later that afternoon, during a lull, Hunter sat in the corner booth, trying to secretly reassemble his disassembled sniper rifle under the table, a habit he couldn't break. Dylan, waddling on his sturdy little legs, spotted him. My son approached the great assassin, his blue eyes wide with curiosity. Hunter froze, his breath catching as the boy he desperately wanted to hold stood just inches away. Hunter offered a hesitant soft smile, holding out a hand. Dylan stared at the hand. Then he looked at the open barrel of the $10,000 custom-machined sniper rifle resting on Hunter's knee. My son puffed out his cheeks. With the pressurized force of a deep-sea blowhole, Dylan spat a concentrated stream of corrosive, highly acidic Atlantic saltwater straight down the barrel of the rifle. The expensive metal hissed instantly, the inner mechanics frying. Hunter closed his eyes. A single muscle ticked in his jaw. He didn't yell. He didn't move. Dylan then casually reached out, plucked the state-of-the-art, encrypted tactical earpiece from Hunter's shoulder, popped it into his mouth, and bit down crack. Good boy, Dylan, I called out casually from the bar, drawing a glass. Don't swallow the wires. Spit it out. Dylan spat the crushed plastic onto Hunter's pristine combat boot, gave a happy little purr, and waddled away. Hunter just sat there, covered in baby spit and ruined weaponry, wearing a pink apron. He looked at me, completely defeated, yet his eyes burned with a stubborn, pathetic fire. He wasn't going to quit. And heaven help me, it was the most entertaining thing I had ever witnessed. Seattle nights belonged to the fog. It rolled in off the Puget Sound, thick, suffocating, and tasting heavily of salt and rust. By 2 a.m., Ethan's seafood barbecue was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass and the hum of the industrial refrigerators downstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in the small apartment above the diner, staring at my legs in the dim, ambient light of the street lamps. They looked human enough. But beneath the skin, my bones felt like they were packed with crushed glass. In my first life, I had forced my tail to split. I had starved myself of the ocean, enduring the agonizing biological suppression of my merman genetics just so I could walk on a dry, hardwood floor in a penthouse to greet a man who rarely came home. The magic of my rebirth had healed my heart, but the physical toll of those years still lingered, on damp, freezing nights like this. The phantom pain roared back to life, a brutal reminder of the price of blind devotion. I clenched my jaw, pressing the heels of my hands into my aching knees. I didn't make a sound. I had learned long ago that screaming to an empty room only made the silence louder. Then, the floorboards outside my door didn't creak, they simply shifted. The door pushed open. I didn't reach for the knife on my nightstand. Only one man in the world could move with that kind of terrifying, absolute silence. Hunter stepped into the room, abandoning his pink apron for a simple black t-shirt and sweatpants. But he didn't have a gun in his hands. He was carrying a heavy wooden basin filled with steaming water. I didn't call for room service, busboy, I rasped, my voice laced with a tremor of pain I hated letting him hear. Hunter didn't say a word. The legendary assassin, a man whose presence made warlords sweat, dropped to his knees on the cheap linoleum floor at my feet. He set the basin down. The scent of warm Atlantic sea salt, crushed kelp, and sweet medicinal herbs instantly filled the room. He had been brewing it downstairs in my kitchen. Get out, Hunter, I ordered, my tone dropping into that cold, dangerous siren frequency. I don't need your pity. It's not pity, he whispered, his voice rough and raw. He didn't look up at my face. He kept his eyes lowered, staring at my trembling legs. I heard your breathing change from downstairs. I know the rhythm of your sleep, Ethan. You haven't slept properly in 3 days, please just let me do my job. Before I could kick him away, he reached out, his hands large, heavily calloused and scarred from a lifetime of violence, wrapped around my ankles. I gasped, not from pain, but from the sudden, shocking contrast. His touch wasn't the ruthless grip of a killer. It was impossibly gentle, carrying a reverence that bordered on worship. He slowly lifted my feet and placed them into the steaming basin. The relief was instantaneous. The heavily concentrated saltwater immediately reacted with my latent merman biology. A faint, bioluminescent blue glow shimmered just beneath the surface of the water as the minerals seeped into my aching joints. The sensation of crushed glass began to dissolve, replaced by a warm, soothing hum. Hunter didn't stop there. He dipped his hands into the water and began to massage my calves. His thumbs found the exact pressure points, working out the deeply knotted muscles with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The deadliest hands in North America were currently dedicated to easing the pain they had indirectly caused. I leaned my head back against the wall, closing my eyes. I intended to stay rigidly awake, to show him that this changed nothing. But the warmth of the water and the hypnotic, steady pressure of his hands were a lethal combination. My breathing slowed. I let my guard drop, just a fraction, pretending the exhaustion had finally pulled me under. Through the slits of my eyes, I watched him. Hunter stopped massaging for a moment. He looked at my face, ensuring I was asleep. In the shadows, stripped of his weapons and his arrogance, he looked utterly broken. He slowly leaned forward and pressed his forehead against my wet knee. "I'm sorry," he breathed, the words barely audible over the rain. "I'm so damn sorry, Elias." He still called me by that name in the dark. Not out of disrespect, but because that was the boy he had broken, the boy he was desperately trying to put back together. He stayed there, his broad shoulders shaking silently, a monster weeping at the feet of the god he had abandoned. A soft rustling sound broke the heavy silence. From the small toddler bed in the corner of the room, Dylan shifted. My son sat up, rubbing his sleepy blue eyes. He looked at the massive man kneeling on the floor. Hunter froze, holding his breath, terrified that the boy would start screaming again and wake me. But Dylan didn't scream. Still half asleep, guided by a child's pure instinct, the little boy tumbled out of his bed. His tiny bare feet padded across the floor until he stood right beside Hunter. Hunter slowly turned his head, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperate hope. Dylan let out a soft, sleepy yawn. He didn't look at the scars on Hunter's face or the lethal muscle of his arms. My son simply swayed on his feet, reached out, and wrapped his tiny hands around Hunter's thick, scarred bicep. With a small, contented sigh, Dylan rested his cheek against Hunter's arm and instantly fell back asleep, standing up. Hunter stopped breathing. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a silver line down his rugged face before dropping into the basin of salt water. He didn't dare move a muscle. He stayed frozen in that uncomfortable kneeling position, supporting the weight of my sleeping child with one arm while keeping his other hand resting gently on my leg. I watched them both from the shadows of my eyelashes. For the first time since my rebirth, the impenetrable wall of ice I had built around my heart cracked, a deep, quiet fracture. Hunter wasn't just wearing the pink apron to survive. He was wearing it to atone. As the Seattle fog swirled outside the window, the three of us remained in the quiet, breathing in the scent of the sea. It was a fragile, heartbreaking peace. But in the harbor, peace was just the deep breath you took before the storm hit. And come Friday night, the syndicate's enemies would make sure our peace went up in flames. I had always known that peace in the harbor was just an illusion, a temporary truce before the inevitable bloodshed. I just hadn't expected the bloodshed to interrupt my Friday night dinner rush. By 8 p.m., Ethan's seafood barbecue was packed. The air was thick with the rich, intoxicating aroma of charred garlic, melted butter, and roasting deep-sea crab. At their usual corner booth, Vinny and Duke were aggressively devouring a platter of grilled lobster tails, practically weeping with joy. Hunter was navigating the narrow aisles, balancing 3 massive trays of sizzling oysters on his broad shoulders. He was still wearing the sparkly hot pink apron over his tactical black gear. He moved with the lethal grace of a jungle cat, effortlessly dodging clueless tourists and drunk dockworkers. Then, the front doors didn't just open, they exploded inward, shattering the heavy glass into a million glittering pieces across my pristine linoleum floor. The cold Seattle rain blew in, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of cheap cigars, wet leather, and high-caliber ammunition. A dozen men flooded the diner. They weren't the syndicate. They were members of the Sonora cartel, ruthless, heavily armed, and notoriously lacking in manners. The diner erupted into immediate chaos. Normal customers screamed, diving under tables. Vinny and Duke, proving their newfound loyalty as the presidents of my fan club didn't hesitate. They flipped their heavy oak table over, creating a barricade, and began physically tossing innocent bystanders out the back emergency exit to safety. "Nobody ruins the big boss's dinner service," Vinny roared, shielding a terrified waitress. The leader of the cartel, a scarred behemoth with a gold-plated assault rifle, stepped over the broken glass. His crazed eyes scanned the room and instantly locked onto Hunter. Then, he looked at me behind the counter and finally, his gaze drifted toward the ceiling, where Dylan was sleeping upstairs. "The ghost of the syndicate," the cartel leader sneered, his thick accent cutting through the screams. "They said you went soft. They said you retired to play house with a fish cook and a freak child. The bounty on your head, and the kids, is going to buy me a private island." Hunter slowly placed the trays of oysters onto an empty table. He didn't say a word. The air in the diner instantly dropped 20 degrees. The subservient busboy vanished, replaced by the apex predator who had terrorized the global underworld for a decade. His hands instinctively dropped to his waist, wrapping around the twin custom Glocks holstered beneath his pink apron. He was going to slaughter them all. It would take him less than 10 seconds. "Hunter," I called out. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos with the piercing, absolute authority of a siren. Hunter froze, his fingers curled around the grips of his guns. He looked back at me over his shoulder. I didn't flinch. I stood calmly behind the bar, wiping down a wine glass with a white towel. I pointed a single, elegant finger toward the large brass plaque nailed above the kitchen entrance. "Rule number 4, no firearms in the dining room." Hunter looked at the sign. He looked at the 12 heavily armed cartel members leveling assault rifles at his chest. Then, he looked back at me, his eyes pleading for a temporary exemption. "I run a respectable establishment," I said smoothly, pouring myself a small glass of red wine. "You fire a gun in my diner, you're fired." Hunter let out a long, heavy sigh that sounded remarkably like a man accepting his tragic fate. Slowly, deliberately, he drew both Glocks from his waist. The cartel members smirked, thinking he was surrendering. Instead, Hunter tossed the multi-$1,000 weapons into the nearest garbage can with a loud thud. "Yes, boss," Hunter muttered. Then, he reached over to the serving counter. In his right hand, he grabbed a massive, 14-inch solid cast-iron skillet that was currently holding 2 pounds of boiling garlic butter and searing scallops. In his left hand, he picked up a pair of heavy, 2-foot-long industrial steel charcoal tongs. "Kill him," the cartel leader barked. They tried, but shooting at Hunter was like trying to shoot a shadow. He didn't just dodge the bullets, he moved through the spaces between them. He closed the distance in a heartbeat. Clang. The heavy cast-iron skillet met the nearest Sicario's skull with the resounding ring of a church bell. The man dropped instantly out cold. With a fluid spin, Hunter flung the boiling garlic butter from the pan straight into the faces of 2 others. They screamed, dropping their weapons to claw at their blistering eyes. Another cartel goon lunged with a combat knife. Hunter sidestepped, moving with that terrifying, silent grace. He snapped the long charcoal tongs forward, clamping the red-hot steel pincers directly around the man's wrist. There was a sickening crack and the smell of burning skin as the knife clattered to the floor. Hunter swung the man by the trapped arm, using his body as a human shield against a burst of incoming gunfire. It was a beautiful, horrifying ballet of culinary violence. The deadliest assassin in North America was dismantling a heavily armed cartel using nothing but kitchenware and sheer, unadulterated rage. But there were too many of them. While Hunter was busy neutralizing 4 men near the door, the cartel leader noticed a blind spot. He raised his gold-plated rifle, aiming straight for Hunter's exposed back. I took a slow sip of my wine. I didn't shout a warning. I didn't need to. I flicked my wrist. A razor-sharp Kumamoto oyster shell, infused with a fraction of my merman's speed, sliced across the diner like a deadly silver shuriken. It buried itself 2 inches deep into the cartel leader's forearm. He screamed, his finger jerking on the trigger, sending the volley of bullets harmlessly into the ceiling. Before he could recover, Hunter was there, a single, devastating swing of the cast-iron pan to the temple, and the leader crumpled to the floor, joining his unconscious men. Suddenly, the diner was dead silent, save for the patter of the Seattle rain and the groans of broken men. Hunter stood in the center of the wreckage. His chest was heaving. His pink apron was splattered with blood, garlic butter and salsa. The cast-iron pan in his hand was visibly dented in the shape of a human face. He looked at me panting, awaiting my approval. I set my wine glass down. I picked up a small notepad and a calculator, I walked out from behind the counter, my shoes crunching on the broken glass. I stepped over the groaning cartel leader and began to tally. 2 custom mahogany tables shattered. I murmured, tapping the calculator. 4 panoramic front windows. The ceiling plaster. 3 bottles of vintage Pinot Noir. I walked up to Hunter and gently took the dented skillet from his hand. In 1 premium French cast iron pan. Utterly ruined. Hunter swallowed hard, wiping a streak of cartel blood off his cheek with his wrist. I kept my guns holstered, boss. You did, I agreed, tearing the long strip of paper from the notepad and slapping it onto his broad chest. But you still owe me $52,000 in property damage. Hunter stared at the astronomical number on the receipt. Elias. I make minimum wage. I know, I said, offering him a razor-sharp, devastating smile. Congratulations, Hunter. I've extended your employment contract. You now belong to me until October 2085. Now grab a mop. The floors are a mess. The first sign of the nightmare didn't come with the roar of gunfire or the shattering of glass. It came with a terrifying, absolute silence. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The diner was closed for prep. I was in the kitchen, meticulously breaking down a massive bluefin tuna, when I realized I couldn't hear the familiar splashing from the backyard. Dylan was supposed to be in his inflatable kiddie pool, happily terrorizing the stray seagulls. I dropped my knife. A cold dread, sharper than any blade, pierced my chest. I burst through the back door. Dylan wasn't playing. My 18-month-old son was curled into a tight, shivering ball at the bottom of the shallow pool. The water, usually cool and refreshing, was practically boiling from the unnatural heat radiating from his tiny body. I fell to my knees, pulling him into my arms. His skin, usually soft and resilient, felt like sandpaper. The beautiful iridescent scales near his temples were cracked and bleeding a pale, silvery liquid. His breath came in shallow, ragged rasps that sounded like tearing paper. Dylan, I screamed, my voice cracking, losing all its regal siren authority. Hunter was there in a microsecond. The pink apron was discarded. He dropped beside me, his large hands hovering over our son's burning skin, terrified that touching him would cause more pain. What is it? What's happening to him? Hunter demanded, his voice fracturing into pure, unadulterated panic. The legendary assassin looked completely helpless. It's land fever, I choked out, pressing my forehead against Dylan's burning cheek. His merman biology is fighting his human half. He's growing too fast. The kiddie pool isn't enough. He needs pressure. He needs a massive volume of freezing, hypersalinated water to stabilize his core, or his heart will literally explode. I'll get the car. We'll drive to the Puget Sound, Hunter said, already reaching for his keys. It's a 30-minute drive through harbor traffic. Hunter, I sobbed, the primal terror taking over. He doesn't have 30 minutes. He doesn't even have 10. Hunter froze. He looked down at the dying boy in my arms. Then, he slowly turned his head. His gaze cut through the chain-link fence of our alley, locking dead onto the massive windowless, brutalist structure across the street. The West Coast headquarters of the syndicate. Their subterranean server farm, Hunter murmured, his eyes darkening into a pitch black, soulless abyss. It generates too much heat for standard air conditioning. They use a closed-loop, industrial cooling system. Millions of gallons of pressurized, freezing saltwater pumped directly from the deep ocean trench. I looked at him, my breath catching. Hunter. It's a fortress. It was, he corrected, his voice dropping into a deadly, mechanical whisper. He didn't hesitate. He reached out and gently took Dylan from my arms, wrapping the boy securely in a thick, wet canvas tarp. He held his dying son against his chest like a fragile, precious bomb. Then, he reached under the diner's floorboards. For the first time in months, he pulled out his tactical gear. He strapped on a heavy utility belt lined with C4 explosives and grabbed an assault rifle. He didn't look back at me. He just kicked open the back gate and marched straight toward the belly of the beast. I didn't stay behind. I grabbed my 2 sharpest, heaviest Japanese chef's knives, the steel gleaming with deadly promise, and followed the father of my child into hell. Hunter didn't use stealth. He didn't use finesse. He used the raw, devastating power of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He walked right up to the reinforced, blast-proof steel doors of the syndicate headquarters. 2 heavily armed guards stepped forward, raising their weapons. Hunter didn't even slow his pace. He raised his rifle with one hand, holding Dylan tight with the other, 2 precise, depressed shots. The guards dropped before they could even shout. Hunter slapped a block of C4 explosive onto the electronic deadbolt, shielded Dylan with his broad back, and blew the doors off their hinges. The explosion shattered the afternoon harbor fog. We stepped through the smoke and into the sterile, sprawling lobby of the world's deadliest organization. Alarms immediately began to scream a deafening, rhythmic wail accompanied by flashing strobe lights that bathed the gray walls in an emergency red glow. Dozens of elite assassins flooded the upper balconies, their laser sights cutting through the smoke, frantically searching for the invading army. They only found one man, a chef, and a dying toddler. "Stand down, Hunter," a voice boomed over the public address system. It was one of the bosses, watching from a secure camera feed. "You are violating sanctuary protocols. Drop your weapons." Hunter ignored them. He marched straight toward the center of the lobby, where a massive, decorative titanium column housed the main intake valves for the subterranean cooling system. Bullets began to rain down. They chipped the marble floor and sparked against the walls. Hunter moved with that terrifying, impossible grace, dodging the crossfire while completely shielding Dylan with his own body. He reached the titanium column. He didn't try to hack the keypad. He slapped 3 blocks of concentrated explosives directly onto the primary pressure joints. "Ethan, brace yourself," Hunter roared over the gunfire. He triggered the detonator. The shockwave knocked the closest assassins off the balconies. The titanium column didn't just break, it violently ruptured. A deafening roar echoed through the lobby as millions of gallons of freezing, mineral-rich deep-sea water violently erupted from the shattered pipes like a geyser. The sheer force of the water shattered the lobby's structural glass, blowing out the reception desks and sweeping heavily armed men off their feet. Within seconds, the massive ground floor was transformed into a churning, waist-deep indoor ocean. Hunter dropped to his knees in the rushing flood, completely submerging himself and Dylan. I waded through the chaotic currents, the freezing water biting at my skin, reawakening the latent magic in my blood. I reached them just as Hunter pulled Dylan's face above the surface. The transformation was miraculous. The icy, high-pressure salt water flooded Dylan's system. The terrifying gasps instantly stopped. The cracked scales on his temples absorbed the minerals, healing in real time, glowing with a brilliant, bioluminescent blue light beneath the red emergency strobes. Dylan opened his eyes, let out a soft, contented purr, and curled his little fingers into Hunter's soaked shirt. Hunter leaned his head back against the shattered pipes, his chest heaving, tears of absolute relief mixing with the saltwater on his scarred face. He had done it. He had saved our son. But the victory was short-lived. Heavy steel blast shutters slammed down over the main exits, sealing us inside. The water level continued to rise, now reaching my chest. From the upper catwalks, over 50 of the Syndicate's most elite killers aimed their weapons down at the makeshift pool. The boss's voice crackled over the PA system again, vibrating with absolute fury. "You betrayed your oath, Hunter, and you brought a freakish abomination into our home. Kill them all. Leave nothing but blood in the water." Hunter slowly stood up. He handed Dylan to me. The relief in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, murderous void. He unholstered a combat knife, the water swirling around his waist. "Hold him, boss," Hunter whispered, not looking at me. "I'm going to clean house." I held my son against my chest, feeling his strong, steady heartbeat. I looked at the army of killers above us. I didn't feel fear. I felt the ocean calling. I dropped my chef's knives into the deep water. I didn't need them anymore. My eyes bled into pitch-black predatory voids. The water around my legs began to swirl, bending to my will. "No, Hunter," I said, my voice resonating with a terrifying, subsonic frequency that cracked the remaining glass in the room. "We are going to clean house." The lobby of the Syndicate's West Coast headquarters was no longer a sterile monument to corporate assassination. It was a churning, waist-deep nightmare of freezing saltwater, shattered marble, and flashing red emergency strobes. And standing at the epicenter of it all, knee-deep in the chaotic tide, was Hunter. He didn't have his custom Glocks. He didn't have his sniper rifles. He had a single, serrated combat knife in the absolute, unyielding will of a father protecting his blood. The first wave of assassins rappelled down from the catwalks, splashing heavily into the flooded lobby. Hunter met them before they could even level their weapons. He was a blur of lethal, mechanical precision. He ducked under a rifle barrel, drove his knee into a man's sternum, and used the falling body as a shield against a burst of incoming fire. He threw his combat knife, burying it into the shoulder of a sniper on the stairs, then retrieved a dropped sidearm from the water, firing 3 blindingly fast shots that sent 3 more killers crashing into the indoor sea. But he was only one man, and he was human. A stray bullet grazed his bicep, blooming a dark cloud of red in the water. Another clipped his thigh. He stumbled, but he didn't fall. He backed up, positioning his broad, bleeding body directly between the army of killers and the submerged crater where I held Dylan. Fire in the hole, someone screamed from the upper balcony. A heavy tactical grenade arced through the air, aimed right for the center of our makeshift pool. Hunter lunged, prepared to smother the explosive with his own chest. He never got the chance. I let go of my human skin. The transformation wasn't a slow, delicate process, triggered by the freezing, mineral-rich deep-sea water and the primal need to protect my mate and my offspring. It was an explosive, violent eruption of biology. The bones in my legs shattered and fused in a microsecond. My skin hardened into thick, iridescent midnight blue scales, impenetrable as titanium. My lungs expanded, drawing power directly from the currents, and my fingernails elongated into jagged, obsidian-sharp claws. I wasn't a chef in that moment. I was a god of the deep. I shot out of the water like a torpedo. I intercepted the grenade in midair, catching the deadly explosive in my bare, clawed hand. I didn't throw it back. I simply crushed it. The detonator sparked and died uselessly under the crushing pressure of a merman's grip. The entire lobby went dead silent. Over 50 elite assassins stared down in absolute horror as I rose from the churning water. I towered over them, a terrifying, majestic apex predator, my massive, powerful tail displacing gallons of water with every subtle twitch. What is that? A sniper stammered, dropping his rifle. I am the owner of the block, I whispered. My voice wasn't human. It was a low, vibrating frequency that made the water ripple and the remaining glass in the lobby groan. I looked up at the secure camera box where the boss was hiding. I opened my mouth, drawing in a massive breath of air, and unleashed the siren's shriek. It wasn't a sound you could just hear, it was a sound that tore through your physical being. A devastating, hypersonic shockwave blasted through the cavernous lobby. The results were catastrophic. Every single piece of remaining glass in the building violently detonated into dust. The lights exploded, plunging the room into darkness lit only by emergency flares and the terrifying, bioluminescent blue glow of my scales. Assault rifles jammed as their delicate internal firing pins shattered under the acoustic pressure. The assassins on the catwalks dropped their weapons, clutching their bleeding ears, collapsing to the floor in pure, agonizing vertigo. I dove back into the water, moving with impossible speed. I grabbed the ankles of the men closest to Hunter and dragged them under, tossing them across the lobby like broken toys. Hold your fire. Regroup, a commander shouted from the main blast doors, desperately trying to rally a dozen men who still had functioning shotguns. Before they could aim the heavy, reinforced steel blast doors didn't open. They were violently rammed off their tracks by a stolen, armored tactical vehicle. The truck smashed into the flooded lobby, sending a tidal wave of water over the remaining guards. The doors of the truck flew open, and out stepped Vinny and Duke, armed to the teeth with heavy machine guns, wearing matching, custom-printed t-shirts that read, "Ethan's Seafood Barbecue Loyalty Member." Behind them poured 20 of the syndicate's own grunts, all regulars from my diner, all pointing their weapons directly at their former commanders. "Nobody shoots the boss," Vinny roared, racking the slide of his shotgun. "And nobody ruins Friday night dinner service." "Stand down. We're unionizing," Duke bellowed, firing a warning shot into the ceiling. The remaining loyalist assassins, already deafened by my shriek, terrified by the giant merman in the water, and now flanked by a mutiny from their own ranks, completely broke. They dropped their shotguns into the water and raised their hands in surrender. The battle was over. The deadliest organization on the West Coast had been dismantled in under 10 minutes by a chef, a busboy, and a plate of magic squid. I swam back to the center column. Hunter was leaning heavily against the shattered pipes, clutching his bleeding arm, panting heavily. I surfaced beside him, wrapping my strong, scaled arms around his waist to keep him upright. Dylan popped his little head out of the water, giggling happily, clapping his tiny hands at the sight of Vinny and Duke. "You okay, busboy?" I asked softly, my voice returning to its normal, smooth cadence. Hunter looked at me, taking in my fully transformed, monstrously beautiful state. He didn't look afraid. He looked at me with absolute, reverent awe. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against my scaled shoulder. "I've never been better, boss," he rasped. I turned my attention upward, above us. The secure glass of the boss's viewing room had been completely blown out by my shriek. The old man who ran the West Coast Syndicate was peering over the ledge, trembling uncontrollably, staring at the ruin of his empire. "You," the boss stammered, his voice cracking over the broken PA system. "You destroyed everything. Millions of dollars. Decades of work." I flicked my massive tail, creating a splash that soaked his expensive suit. Your cooling system is ruined. Your structural integrity is compromised. And your staff just quit. I called up to him, my eyes flashing with a dangerous, predatory amusement. This building is effectively condemned. I reached into the waterproof pocket of my ruined chef's apron, pulled out a single, soggy $1 bill, and flicked it with deadly precision. The wet bill flew through the air like a shuriken, slapping directly onto the center of the boss's forehead. "I'm buying the property," I declared. "Pack your things. You have until midnight to vacate my new restaurant." 6 months is a mere blink of an eye to a creature of the deep ocean, but on the surface, it was enough time to completely rewrite the history of the Seattle underworld. The brutalist, windowless fortress that once housed the West Coast Syndicate was gone. In its place stood the Abyssal Pearl, a multi-million-dollar, 5-star seafood empire and private aquatic sanctuary. The reinforced concrete walls had been blown out and replaced with towering panels of reinforced structural glass, casting a mesmerizing, bioluminescent blue glow onto the foggy harbor streets. I stood on the mezzanine balcony of my pristine, state-of-the-art kitchen, swirling a glass of vintage Pinot Noir. I looked down through the panoramic windows at the front entrance. A sleek black Bentley pulled up to the valet stand. The valet who rushed forward to open the door wasn't a college student. He was a 60-year-old man in a tailored, albeit slightly tight, burgundy uniform. It was the former supreme boss of the syndicate. "Welcome to the Pearl, sir. Allow me to park that for you," the old man grumbled, forcing a painful, strained smile as a wealthy tourist handed him the keys. I took a slow sip of my wine, a smirk playing on my lips. Buying the building for $1 was satisfying, but forcing the former overlords of the criminal underworld to work off their multi-million-dollar property damage debts by parking cars and checking coats, that was true art. Vinian Duke, officially promoted to head of security and VIP Maitre d', made sure the old men never took a smoke break longer than 5 minutes. It was 1 a.m. The restaurant was officially closed. The only sound left in the cavernous space was the gentle, rhythmic hum of the industrial saltwater filtration system. I set my wine glass down and descended the grand spiral staircase, moving toward the centerpiece of the restaurant, a massive, 2-story cylindrical glass aquarium that formed the core of the dining room. Inside the crystal-clear water, completely unbothered by the late hour, was Dylan. My 2-year-old son was in his full merman form, his iridescent midnight blue scales shimmering under the soft ambient lights. He wasn't confined to a cheap plastic kiddie pool in a dirty alleyway anymore. He was darting through synthetic coral reefs, giggling a stream of silver bubbles as he chased a playful manta ray I had imported from the Pacific. He was safe. He was a prince in his own castle. I walked past the tank and entered the submerged glass viewing tunnel beneath it, and there, standing in the center of the tunnel, was the deadliest man to ever walk the American shadows. Hunter was wearing black tactical pants, a tight black t-shirt that clung to his heavily scarred, muscular frame, and stubbornly, the violently bright pink kissed the cook apron. He was sweating profusely, his broad shoulders flexing rhythmically as he aggressively pushed a heavy industrial mop across the reinforced glass floor. He had spent the last 6 months systematically hunting down the remnants of the syndicate's loyalists across the country, ensuring no one would ever dare look in Dylan's direction again. He had bled, he had fought, and he had secured our empire. Yet, every single night, he returned to Seattle, put on the pink apron, and scrubbed the floors without uttering a single word of complaint. He was paying his penance in blood, sweat, and bleach. My footsteps echoed softly in the glass tunnel. Hunter stopped immediately. He leaned against the long wooden handle of the mop and turned to face me. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his heavily calloused hand. Even exhausted, looking at me, his dark eyes held that same terrifying, unwavering devotion. "The floors are looking pristine, busboy," I said, my voice echoing smoothly in the quiet tunnel. "Only the best for you, boss," Hunter rasped, his voice rough but laced with a profound, quiet peace. "Dylan's eating well. He chased down 2 live salmon for dinner before the manta ray tired him out." "I know," I murmured. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a foot away. I looked at the dark bags under his eyes, the new, jagged scar running along his collarbone from a bullet he had taken 3 months ago, meant to completely sever the cartel's supply lines. He had destroyed his own world just to earn the right to mop the floors in mine. The phantom pain in my legs, the lingering cold from my past life, it was finally entirely gone. The ice around my heart hadn't just melted, it had evaporated. "Your 6-month probationary period is up," I said softly, my tone slipping into a formal, Cold cadence. Hunter stiffened. He gripped the mop handle tighter, his chest rising and falling heavily. Despite killing warlords with his bare hands, the legendary assassin looked absolutely terrified that I was about to fire him. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored chef's coat and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. I handed it to him. "I've conducted your performance review," I continued, watching his face. "You're a terrible waiter. You scare the elite clientele, but your loyalty is acceptable. I've drafted a new contract, a shareholder agreement. I'm offering you equity in the Pearl." Hunter blinked confused. He wiped his hands nervously on the pink apron before taking the envelope. He opened the seal with a thick thumb and pulled out the single sheet of thick, watermarked paper. He began to read. It wasn't a shareholder agreement. It was a state of Washington marriage certificate. And on the bottom right line, elegantly penned in black ink, was my signature, Ethan. Hunter stopped breathing. The air in the glass tunnel seemed to vanish. He stared at my name on the paper, his hands trembling so violently the document shook. He read it again and again, as if afraid the ink was an illusion. I reached into my pocket one last time. I pulled out a heavy, matte black tungsten ring. I didn't hand it to him. I simply flicked my wrist, tossing it through the air. Hunter's seeker reflexes kicked in. He caught the ring midair without looking away from the paper. "Finish mopping the glass, sign the paper, and put the damn ring on," I whispered, my voice finally dropping its icy facade, revealing the deep, ocean warmth beneath. "You're promoted, idiots." The mop hit the floor with a loud, clattering thud. Hunter didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second. He dropped to his knees right there on the wet glass floor, wrapping his massive arms around my waist, pressing his face into my stomach. He let out a ragged, shaking breath, the sound of a man who had been drowning for 2 lifetimes and had finally, miraculously, found the surface. I smiled, weaving my fingers through his dark hair, feeling the heavy, steady thud of his heart against my chest. Above us, in the bioluminescent blue water, Dylan swam over the glass ceiling. He pressed his tiny, scaled hands against the glass, looking down at his father's, letting out a soft, happy purr that vibrated through the water. The deadly ghost of the syndicate was dead. The pathetic, weeping merman was gone. In their place stood a king and his loyal knight, ruling an empire built on salt blood and grilled squid. The storm was finally over. The ocean had found its shore.